Hello, Sally.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm hanging in there, Sally. So, you're one of the, what's the way to describe it in terms of the city beat who's still around from my first iteration at this. So I always tell people I remember back then there was Liz Benjamin, and that was one of the go-tos that you were around, and then Celeste Katz.
Oh, yeah.
I wonder about Celeste Katz and sort of...
And Seifman.
Yeah, one of the pioneers was Ben Smith.
That's right. He did the Daily News
in
blog,
the very early day. The Observer had a presence. Like some of these people...
Ozzy, yeah.
Some of these people are I don't know. I'm not saying they're not around. Like, I found out that one of the younger... Well, he's probably not young anymore. Colin Campbell.
He's at Yahoo News,
yes,
maybe? He's an editor.
But I had lost track.
Yeah, not too many people stay for so long.
Yeah, and then I saw Liz in Albany.
Yes.
Liz Benjamin. And it was so good to see her. I had a long time I hadn't seen her. So it's good to see that you're still here. You're still persevering, right? And thriving. But it's an interesting, like, how things have changed, right? In terms of the industry, in terms of the news, in terms of the way it's covered, in terms of technology, things like AI, right? Like even this thing is a very common thing.
Podcast.
Yes, and I was like, I say to myself, I said, man, it was like really hard for me. One, I'm not tech savvy, and two, it was like literally like, on the fly. And now the way it's set up is like, look at, it's like really user friendly these days. But look, it's enough of this sort of walk down memory lane. There's a lot happening. You're very busy. You have plenty. There's plenty of work for you these days in terms of I want to start with just like and I asked someone, I think I asked Joe Anuta this question. And Errol Lewis wrote an interesting, and Katie Honan is really commented on it, and sort of the relationship with the administration and the press. Yeah. And there's always going to be a contentious relationship, right? Like it's part of the ecosystem. Like I was talking to someone who's an advocate, and I remember working in the administration and in the prior administration, and just sort of like the theater that goes in between government and advocates. Yeah. Like, it's like, you fight one day, but you understand they're knowledgeable people. Right. And their heart's in the right place, right? And they want to help, and they do help shape policy and shape the way things are done, because they come at it from a perspective of like the grassroots. Mm-hmm. And for you all, I know for a while there was the trailer, 1PP. Oh, yeah. There's like the seats in room 9. What do you make? What's the latest state of play? What's your sense in comparison to other administration and this administration when it comes to the relationship with the press corps?
Such a good question. I mean, I think there's, like you said, there's a baseline tension. So I covered 3 mayors, Bloomberg, de Blasio, and Eric Adams. And all 3 had a contentious relationship with the press. So that sort of frustration that public officials have with reporters who cover them in New York City and New York State is tense, and I think it always will be. So that's consistent. I think the difference is how the press office staff and the reporters interact behind the scenes. So I'll just take it back to Bloomberg, because they're all pretty different. The Bloomberg press operation was like internally very powerful. I think Bloomberg, as somebody who started a media company, really valued media, even if he didn't like the press that covered him. And so there was a very like professional press operation. They answered, I don't want to say they answered all our questions in full and responded to all our foils, because never satisfactorily to any reporter's, standard. Mm-hmm. But there was definitely a responsiveness, and there was an interest in the technicalities of government that translated into how that press office interacted with the press. And I think they would argue, or press people would argue, the press was perhaps more interested in the technicalities of government. The newspapers covered. I worked at the time at the New York Post, and my boss, who was a real like legend in New York reporting, Dave Seifman. I mean, he read the City Record. He read every agency report. So he did a lot of political, like hot political stories, but he was also very interested in governance. And so in the Bloomberg press office, there was a real attention to detail about like stories, and they were always going to spin them for Bloomberg, and we were going to write whatever we wrote, and there was always going to be tension, but it was very professional is the word I keep saying. De Blasio didn't like the press and didn't internally value the press as much as he did his intergovernmental operation. That was his, that was king for him because he's a political operative. I mean, they're all politicians, but he came up as a political operative and more so than any other mayor I've covered or seen, really cared about the internal politics. I'm sure you know that too, having worked there. So IGA was super powerful, the press office less so. So they still, there was still a relationship and they answered questions, but there was less when there was a budget day, Mike Bloomberg would do this, and granted, he's a money guy, but he did a big budget presentation at 10 a.m. and then a background briefing and all. He was very into it. That, I think, went down a beat with de Blasio. He still, did the stuff, to give us the information, the, kind of technical information we needed to do our stories. But it wasn't as primary to him. I think he thought he would never get a fair shake in the press. The New York Post really, was pretty brutal with him, and he didn't, in turn, really know how to work them. And so the relationship just devolved. During COVID, you saw him do a daily briefing and really his team would be very serious about making sure we had information. But prior to COVID, it was the hostility took over. But it was still, it was still an operation. It was more political. Eric Adams is just different entirely. So he's actually, I would say, of those three mayors, he's the best at communicating on TV. He's good on TV. De Blasio was decent on TV, Bloomberg less so, but Eric Adams is a natural at communicating. So when he's in front of a camera, he knows how to sound good, but he has a pretty bad relationship with the press. I think he feels he does not get a fair shake, and the coverage is very negative. I mean, how, on some level, how can it not be? He's been indicted. His whole inner circle is either being investigated, indicted, charged, this, that, the other. But the relationship with his press office and Room 9, the traditional press corps, has kind of devolved. It's hostile. I think Twitter contributes to that, or X, which is now what we call Twitter, or now what Twitter's called, contributes to that. Is people put their frustrations out there in public. And I think they think that the shrinking print media means they don't really have to deal with print. They can just put him on TV. He looks and sounds good on TV. And it's very negative. He has a good relationship with the Post, unlike de Blasio. The Post is pretty good to him, I would say. Their editorial page likes him. But by and large, his press office is not all that interested in working with the press. So I have, I run Politico's New York bureau, and I have reporters who don't cover the politics. They're just covering policy stuff. And it's very hard for them to get information from agencies because agencies have to call over to City Hall. Everything is very tightly controlled. And in the Bloomberg days, that didn't happen. You could call the Department of Housing and get a number that you need for your story. De Blasio was sort of in the middle of the two, and under Eric Adams, I find it, at least the agencies we cover, they're always we have to go to City Hall, and City Hall doesn't like the nature of your last story, so we're not going to give you this. And then reporters and editors like myself get angry because we're we're just trying to write a story about this policy, so it just gets it's just very hostile.
Interesting. Sally, separate. Now let's move on to the thank you for that. Let's move on to the latest news. Based on what the DA, right, and the situation with Ingrid Lewis-Martin, do you think this was what do you think of his mayoralty and the likelihood of a re-election?
I think I want to split the mayoralty up into two different issues, if you don't mind.
Sure.
There's the legal stuff and the governance. So I think he appointed a lot of people to his inner circle whom longtime government observers and veterans thought, were head scratchers. They either thought they were ill-suited to their jobs, possibly corrupt, a number of things. There are a lot of good people in city government who I think do a good job, but they're not maybe in his, in his inner circle. And And many of those people, lo and behold, have left because either their homes were raided, which doesn't mean you did anything wrong, but it's not a good look, right? Or they were, they're being investigated. In the case of the mayor himself and Ingrid Lewis-Martin, they've been indicted. This is someone who came into office having survived clouds of investigations, and I think he felt emboldened. But I think to the political chattering class, there was a sense that, there was a sense that doom was there, and this is not shocking. And I think he could have avoided this by not giving this many people who had checkered past such important jobs, at such highly visible jobs. It's almost thumbing your nose at law enforcement. I think it's bad, and I think it shakes confidence in governance. He's trying to turn the page on this. I mean, he's, at the urging of the governor and just public opinion, he's let go the people who have been, who are in trouble or were in trouble or look like they might be in trouble. And now government is being run by government veterans. Maria Torres Springer's a government veteran, is the first deputy mayor, and kind of flows from there. And people seem to have a good opinion of her. So I think the legal stuff is bad. I mean, there's, it's not a very deep analysis, but I think it's bad. And I think he's trying to turn the page. The mayoralty itself is kind of a mixed bag. Because a lot of these people didn't have the experience to have the jobs they had, I think people would say that the government hasn't been well managed. That said, I think he is kind of saying and focusing on the things that voters care about. To my point earlier about how he sounds good on TV, when Eric Adams goes on TV and talks about policing, I think he's saying what most New Yorkers, even Democrats in a Democratic primary, want to hear. Maybe not the activists for sure, because he's very pro-police. When he talks about the migrant situation, I think he's saying and doing what, I mean, we'll see what happens in a re-election. I could be wrong, but I think he's on the same page as most New Yorkers. And so on the issues, even though the running of the issues is not great, I think he is sort of personifying how a lot of people feel. And so that's positive for him in a re-election. He can get out there and say, I want the city to be safer, and I value our police, and I do care about, people of color and people who are, don't have a lot of money and people who are struggling, but I want the city to be safe. I want to clean our streets. And he can say that in a way that no other candidate can, and that's always been his, his kind of trump card. The problem is that he's been mayor for 4 years, and when you look at the polling, people don't feel great about the state of the city. So, it is, like I said, it's a mixed bag.
Does Cuomo run, Sally?
I think if he thinks there's an avenue, yes. Cuomo is...
What is the avenue?
Eric Adams is so weak that Andrew Cuomo can peel off black votes. I think that's the way he needs to do this. So they have similar bases. Cuomo's historically been popular with black Democrats and Orthodox Jewish Democrats, and both are very important, coveted voting blocs. And Cuomo historically hasn't been as popular as some other politicians with the traditional white liberals in Park Slope and on the Upper West Side. I think in an election where those voters who never liked Eric Adams are desperate for what they perceive as strong management, Cuomo has a much better chance with them. But he does need to peel away Black and Hispanic and Orthodox Jewish voters from Eric Adams. I think if he thinks he can, I'm sure he's polling internally. He's watching the legal cases very closely. If he thinks there's a chance that, he can do that, I think he gets in. My suspicion, not knowing the man personally, is that he'd rather be governor. That would be the ultimate vindication. He had to step down. He feels he was treated very unfairly. Kathy Hochul, the governor, is politically very weak, but he has to wait till 2026 for that, and the mayor's race is right here. The mayor's been indicted. Everyone around him is getting, their homes raided. So it's how can he not look at this? Yeah. So TBD, but I think he's looking at it.
Sally, any of the candidates in the race right now, does anybody impress you? And just from a press perspective, you get their announcements, their policy platforms. Has anybody just stood out?
Zoran Mamdani.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Why?
Just he has the it factor. His politics are very far left, and I would assume are too far left for the average voter in a Democratic primary, even though the average voter in a Democratic primary is left of center. Zoran Mamdani is affiliated with the DSA, and I think I have a feeling his politics would be too far left, but he knows how to zero in on people's concerns. There was a housing forum recently, and they were asked, would you freeze the rents? Now, that's up to a board that the mayor appoints. The mayor is not supposed to put his or her thumb on the scale, but whatever. It's the mayor-appointed board. And at this forum, Mamdani was like, yeah, people are, I'm paraphrasing, but people are struggling. I'm going to freeze the rents if the rent stabilized tenants. The other candidates were kind of gave these more middling answers that might be more technically appealing if you really know the way this works, but they don't sound good. So I think he sounds good, and I think he's got that that je ne sais quoi that you need to be good in politics. He's a good retail politician.
Thoughts on Governor Hochul? Do you think she's in real trouble? Meaning,
yes.
Richie Torres is
and Mike Lawler.
Really aggressive. Mike
Richie
Lawler,
Torres.
now Antonio Delgado.
Yes, her own lieutenant governor. I mean, that really says something, excuse me, when your own lieutenant governor is publicly, kind of hinting at people publicly hinting that he will run against you in 2026. I think she's in serious trouble. She needs to turn things around.
What do you attribute that to?
Anti-incumbent sentiment hurts her. The perception that she is weak hurts her. The fact that she was an accidental governor hurts because she hasn't had the experience. I know she was in Congress, of course, and she was duly elected in 2022, but she didn't kind of climb the political ladder and make those relationships with, this union and that voting bloc and this religious person, so that when you get there, at his worst days, Bill de Blasio could always call a union leader, Yvette Clarke. He had his people. She just doesn't really have that. She doesn't have a natural connection to New York City, where most votes are. And then, there's sexism. And, I'm not going to say that's not part of it, too. So some things are out of her hands. Some things aren't out of her hands. But she's got to really toughen up publicly. I'm not saying she's not personally tough, but her public persona has to be a lot sharper, because they're coming at her from every side.
Sally, any thoughts on the comptroller's race?
I honestly haven't thought about it as much with everything else going on. So I guess Mark Levine, the Manhattan Borough president, seems pretty well positioned. He's won Manhattan-wide, and that's important for a citywide race. He's well liked. He's close with Adriano Espaillat, who's, important and moves votes in Latino areas. He himself speaks Spanish, which I think is going to be helpful. He's very pro-development, which might hurt him with people who are suspicious of development. I don't know a whole lot about his connections to Brooklyn. Manhattan and Brooklyn just produced the votes.
Reynoso just sort of did a
endorsement.
Yes.
So that's helpful.
Interesting.
But New York is so tribal. I don't know if that helps with Black Brooklyn.
Interesting.
And Justin Brannan, the city council finance chair from Southern Brooklyn, is running. He is. He's a good politician. I think he's got to raise. Levine is ahead of him in the money race and just kind of ahead. So if Brannan can really raise a lot of money, get some endorsements, try to get some votes and some connections in areas where Levine doesn't have them yet, in Caribbean parts of Brooklyn, that could be very helpful, and that could be the race. And then Jennifer Rajkumar, who is a state assemblywoman from Queens, is running. Kind of hard to see her path. She's very close to Eric Adams, who's not popular. Sort of bizarrely, her political connection to him. She goes to these press conferences that she has nothing to do with. They're allies. It happens. But being that close to Eric Adams is not a great way to run this race in a year when he's at 30% and indicted.
Sally, talk about the council, the body, right? Which is a whole interesting, and your take on Speaker Adams. It's been coming from a place where the council and the Blasio didn't veto one bill under the former Speaker Melissa Morvillo, this state of play, right, where it's Mastro and the reporting bill on police, and it's just the electeds form. Which is
solitary
a lot
confinement.
I mean, it's just a whole, and it's also brought in other folks like Jamani, where initially there was a sort of non-aggression pact between him and the mayor, and that turned into a sort of relationship that sort of got toxic quickly. What are your thoughts on how she's run the body, and the analysis of the two, sort of the relationship between the two chambers, which is, it's really like, right, when you thought they had the city a yes, right, then this whole charter thing with Richard Bury, where it's like reviewing, it's like when you think they're beginning to, and that's what people assumed with with the new first deputy mayor, they sort of came in at a honeymoon phase, but yet it's still that.
Well, it's interesting that the toughest council I've ever covered is this one, with a speaker who I don't believe wants to run for higher office. The first speaker I've ever covered who doesn't want to run for higher office naturally comes from the same, literally like went to high school with the mayor, endorsed him in the Democratic primary in 2021. So obviously in the general, she was going to endorse, but she endorsed him in a primary where there were other candidates. It was a very competitive primary. They're both from Southeast Queens. I would have assumed at the beginning of this relationship that it would have been the easiest relationship or the easiest council for any mayor I've covered to deal with. It has been the most contentious relationship I've seen. And I think that's due to the fact that even though she herself, Adrienne Adams, the speaker, doesn't appear to be interested in higher office, which makes you, of course, want to be more bold and combative because you get a lot of press hits off of that. Even though I don't think that's in the cards for her, or something she's not interested in, her members and she herself are offended that the mayor thinks, very little of them. And to be fair to Eric Adams, most mayors want to roll the city council. It's not like unique to Eric Adams. But he's gone about it in a way that has really ticked them off. You mentioned Randy Mastro. I mean, it's a really good example. He was saying, Randy Mastro, who's a very controversial lawyer, is going to be my corporation counsel, running the huge law department. That's one of the few positions in New York City that has advice and consent from the council. He put it out there. They pushed out the judge who was holding that role. She had relationships, so that already ticked people off because she had relationships. Whether or not she was doing the job well, different answers, depends on who you ask. But people were offended on her behalf. And then they put forth this candidate that is very controversial. And as I understand it, Adrienne Adams told the mayor early on, I don't have the votes for this. And he pushed and he pushed. And they won. I mean, Randy Mastro had to pull his name out. There was a hearing that was like so contentious. And so I think that she is the least politically ambitious and yet toughest speaker that I've ever seen. It's such an interesting thing. You would think that Melissa Mark Viverito or Chris Quinn or Corey Johnson, all of whom wanted to either be comptroller, public advocate, or mayor, would have been a lot tougher than she is. But by virtue of how offended her members are, with the actions of the administration and how kind of bold some of those members are, it's really like quite a negative relationship.
Jesus. Sally, the other thing I want to talk to you about related to the dynamics in the city is, what do you think so there's the Eastern District, there's the Southern District, there's now the Manhattan DA's office, and all of this is centered around Eric Adams. What will it take in terms of all these different investigations for you to see or predict a end, right? Let's just say conceivably the Eastern District comes back with something.
Yes.
Do you think politically, right, that at that point the hand of the governor will be forced, conceivably, like to say, hey, this is just like
or
for the good of the party? Or
superseding indictment from the Southern.
What are your thoughts? What will it take? Just a prediction.
My prediction is that and you're asking.
And then there's also the Trump dynamic, right?
So I was actually going to mention that. I actually think, and I could be wrong, I want to stipulate that, I think the most harmful thing for Eric Adams is a pardon from Trump. I think we live in an era where people think the justice system is rigged. I think people of color already thought that because it has, historically been rigged against them, and that's his base. I don't think it's rigged against him in this case. I'm not agreeing with that. I'm just saying I think that assessment exists. Then you have, Donald Trump won with 34 convictions. President Joe Biden said his own justice system is rigged when he pardoned his son. It's just so baked in to the public consciousness, and already is something that Eric Adams voters believe, that I think more problematic for him is a pardon from Trump, who, despite his improvements in New York, still lost 30-70 in New York City, and in general, in a primary it would have been even worse. or his numbers would be worse. I think that is the most damaging thing politically. I think for Governor Hochul to oust Eric Adams, clearly there'd have to be something more because she's seen what she's seen and it wasn't enough for her. And I think she needs cover, frankly, from people because she's white, and I think she would need cover from Al Sharpton and Hakeem Jeffries. That's my read on this situation. But look, I think it would have to be more than it is, and it would have to be something that really hurt the public. I think the argument that those who defend him make is that, like, the plane upgrades that he took didn't hurt the public. So we'd have to see more, like what we saw yesterday with Ingrid Lewis-Martin was fleecing the public, allegedly. And I think it would have to be more in that realm, like where he was really hurting New Yorkers in his role as mayor by doing whatever it is he did, or was allowing one of his aides knowingly, I'm not sure that that's going to happen. These prosecutors are leaving their jobs in like a week, so they don't have a lot of time. Trump likes him and he's president. He's going to appoint prosecutors who are probably going to be friendly to Adams. So I'm not saying it can't happen, but I do think, like, his relationship with Trump seeming to be very warm, and a pardon from Trump. If I were advising him, that's the thing I'd be the most worried about, barring some superseding indictment I'm not aware of. Interesting.
Sally, let's have some fun because I know we have to wrap this up now. Who do you think is one government person in all your years covering politics that you got it right?
A politician?
A politician. We're going to go politician, then government person, right? Carl Weisbrod, right? A lot of people mentioned Dick Ravitch. Let's start with an elected person. A person elected that you could say, wow, this person knows.
And when you say got it right, you mean like...
They just know how to play the game, right?
Let me think about that for a second. Tish James.
Interesting.
I thought literally for 1 second and she popped in my mind.
Why?
I mean, look how popular she is. Her numbers are very strong. She's attorney general. She's suing Trump and the NRA. And she's not getting any incoming. She sets her own agenda. But she has said it quite masterfully. She takes a lot of heat from Cuomo, and there are pieces of that case that seem to be coming apart, her case against Cuomo, so I want to stipulate that might end up being more of a problem for her depending on what happens. But I think broadly, politically, she played it right when she was in the city council. She won on the Working Families Party line, not the Democratic line, back before. I think she was the first person who ever did. So she sort of saw that party as a point of strength when no one else did. And for a while it no longer is. She was very good in the city council. I covered her in the council. She was very good in kind of honing in on the attacks against Mike Bloomberg, which was like the way to go at that time. She was put out some, like, I don't remember that much about her tenure as public advocate, but, she, like, I guess handled it well enough, and then she became attorney general when Eric Schneiderman resigned in scandal, and has just really played it right throughout. Again, this issue with Cuomo notwithstanding, because I know that he has called her case into question. But I think by and large, she's very popular and has pretty much always been popular and comes from a part of Brooklyn that votes in big numbers. She's formidable. She's not a good fundraiser, but she's formidable nonetheless. So that would be my got it right
government person.
Well, he was a politician and now he's in government. I think Dan Garodnick.
Wow.
He's the city planning commissioner. He had been a city councilman. He's very bright. He got City of Yes passed, even with that relationship being so toxic between the council and the mayor. As I understand it, he was the one who was kind of doing the intergov as a commissioner and as a planning chair, because the relationship with the mayor's intergov and the council was so tense, and he got it done. I mean, it was a close vote, but it was always going to be a close vote. And he's very respectful of people, and he really knows his stuff on policy. So, yeah, I've always thought he was like a very good government official.
Best day on the job.
Best day on the job for me.
You. Best day in all your years reporting. Best day that you think you got it right.
I did a story about we don't really know where Eric Adams lives, which people still kind of don't know where Eric Adams lived at the time. And I was proud that even though you could argue who cares, I thought it was emblematic of his high level of secrecy for a public official. And when I wrote it, everybody followed it, and the New York Times put it on the front page, and I was very proud of that because I thought it mattered. I still think his level of secrecy says something about him and is strange and is revealing in its own way. And so, I know that's like a weird answer, but I was like really like proud when everyone picked that up, and he gave us a tour of his like so-called apartment because he wanted to prove he lived there. And I thought it really like exposed something about him that people kind of hadn't put their finger on yet.
Worst day.
This is an interesting thing. It was an interesting story to cover, and I just thought about it today because I think it was today or right around today. But when the two police officers were murdered under Bill de Blasio in 2014, Ramos and Liu, even though it was a very interesting story to cover, it was very sad I was at the hospital at Woodhull. They, were pronounced dead. That's when the police turned their backs on Bill de Blasio. And it was, it was just very sad, the whole thing. I thought it was a tragedy for the city, and, we covered it objectively and covered the fallout for many years to come. It really shaped who de Blasio was and how he handled his relationship with the NYPD, but I thought that was tragic. And I'm thinking about it today because I think it was right around this day, 10 years ago.
Yeah. Sally, I want to thank you for taking the time to do this, and hopefully this won't be the last time. And
Thank
hope you had some
so much fun, yes.
Thank you.